Hello, everybody, and thank you for coming along to this seminar on child criminal exploitation. So my name is Malcolm Johnson, and I am the head of the abuse team at Lyme Solicitors. And so today we're going to be talking about child criminal exploitation. Thank you all for coming along. There will be a slot at the end for questions. And if you have any other questions after that, I think you all know by now, many of you will have attended these seminars, that you can always ask me specific questions if you wish, either by emailing me or you can ring me. The notes, the slides, and the notes which come with the slides will be sent out to all of you after the seminar. If you don't receive them for whatever reason, just email Amika, who's coordinating the slides, the seminar with me, and we can get them to you. So that's absolutely fine. Anyway, without further ado, let's look at this issue. So let's look at what we're going to try to do. So what we're going to try and do today is explain the various types of criminal exploitation, how it's labeled by the authorities, how you can recognize the signs of criminal exploitation, and how the law and the authorities try to deal with criminal exploitation. We're also looking at asylum-seeking children as well. Now, somebody had said on the delegates list that they had a problem with children coming along saying, well, we're streetwise and we're so streetwise that we know what we're doing. And we're talking specifically about young girls meeting older men in public parks and thinking to themselves, well, that's quite safe. And I think that really sums up the problem here is that inquiry after inquiry has stressed how difficult it is to get children to disclose that they are victims of exploitation. It is extremely difficult. But those of us who deal with children, and we all deal with children, know that the starting point has to be to gain the child's trust. If you can gain the child's trust, they may disclose. And we all know that when they do disclose, they will not say, I have been subject to child exploitation by A, B, and C. Here are their addresses, and here is a list of the offences that they have committed against me. That just simply doesn't happen. It takes time and it takes a great deal of effort. And this is a problem which the authorities admit quite openly. They do not know the full extent of child exploitation. They simply don't know. There are moves, as we'll see later, to try to improve the data that's available to authorities, but it is very much something that takes place in the dark, which is why it's so difficult to prosecute. It's not that we don't prosecute it, we do. There are more prosecutions. The problem is actually dealing with it on the ground as it's happening. And very often you'll find that when there are prosecutions, you're talking about allegations being made about things that have happened some years ago. And so coming back to the point that was made about children being streetwise, well, it's my experience that most of my clients, people who come to me who've been victims of exploitation, they're coming forward in their late 20s, 30s, 40s, whatever it might be. Children may believe that they are streetwise, but this brings me to my next point when you're dealing with a child, is that I think it's very important when dealing with a child who is saying something to you, and they wouldn't be sitting opposite you unless they wanted to say something to you. I think it's very important to say there are consequences. There are consequences. Supposedly streetwise children are turning up years on. They're turning up with severe mental health problems, drug addiction, sexually transmitted diseases, the consequences of those diseases. They're turning up with serious physical injuries. And in one or two cases, they even turn up dead. That's how serious it is. I think if you can get that across to a child, it may make a difference. And from there on in, I think it's a process of reassurance. This is not something where the authorities can do nothing. As we can see, this is a problem that the authorities are acutely aware of, and they have a various tools that they can use to try and tackle it. It does not mean a criminal prosecution. There's all sorts of civil orders, other things that can be done to protect children. Obviously, some cooperation is needed, but it's not a completely hopeless situation. So it's difficult, but not hopeless. So this seminar is really intended to try to give you some idea of what can be done in these situations. Could we have a next slide, please, Amika? Okay, so the scale of a problem, we've got something like 127 major police investigations at present underway into child sexual exploitation and gang grooming across 29 police forces. And it's estimated, this is just one snapshot of Rotherham, that something like 1,400 girls were sexually exploited from the late 1980s onwards. The consequences, which we've already talked about, these are very serious. And I think it's important that we set these out and we realize what those consequences are, because a child that's being exploited, actually they simply won't realize, no matter how. I mean, I think streetwise is, I translate that as living in a fantasy world, because to a child, these are their friends. These are people who may be boyfriends. They may be people who are protectors, or they may just simply enjoy the process, basically, of being in a gang that is selling drugs, whatever it might be. They will have very mixed feelings. So there's a sort of good and a bad part of it, but it is impossible for them to fully process the implications. Um, in the notes, we have a number of links, but there's a very useful booklet from the NHS, which is about the medical consequences of sexual exploitation, and it merits reading. Could we have the next slide, please, Amika? Let me just get back to my notes. Okay, right. So we had a report, and the report was from something called the Independent Inquiry into Child Sexual Abuse. Now, that was inquiry that reported in 2022, and it made a number of recommendations. And these are some of the recommendations it went, because what it did is it examined the problem of child sexual exploitation. Now, there'd been other inquiries before, of course, but they are at a local level. This was a national inquiry into the problem. And what they did is they looked at several towns where there had been child exploitation and said, well, what conclusions can we draw from that? Now, their recommendation was, we've got to hand out tougher sentences. So if you're grooming a child, you get a bigger sentence than you would if you just simply abuse that child. We should have an enhanced version of a child exploitation disruption toolkit. We'll look at that later, but it is a toolkit which is published on the internet that tells you how the authorities can disrupt child exploitation other than having to prosecute people. Department for Education, which is responsible for children, basically should review and publish an updated of its guidance. There is present guidance, which we'll look at briefly. Local authorities in England and Wales should ensure their assessment of risk and harm. So at the moment, local authorities say, well, is this a child who's at risk of child exploitation? What the inquiry said is that's wrong. This is not a matter of risk, basically. The way you've got to categorize it, you say, are they subject to child exploitation? Are they at risk, or could they be subject to child exploitation in the future? So rather than just saying at risk, we need to broaden out those categories. Police forces and local authorities should collect data, and that includes data on the ethnic origins of both perpetrators and victims. And the reason for that is that in the past, as we all know, is there has been a fear that if we say, well, it's predominantly men from, say, the Pakistani community, and it's not, if we say that, that will be seen as racist. It's absolutely essential that their data enables the authority to know where the abuse is happening, what particular parts of the community is it happening with, which geographical locations. Because once you start building up that picture, you can then see more, you can tackle it far better. So data is absolutely key to tackling child exploitation. And the Department of Education should ban the placement in semi-independent and independent settings of children aged 16 and 17. So, you know, a child who, say, is a care leaver is put into semi-independent accommodation. They are particularly vulnerable, as we will all know, because they get a lesser standard of care. There have, of course, been moves to try to improve the regulation of these kinds of placements. But the reality is that these particular children, 16 and 17-year-olds, are particularly vulnerable. Could we have the next slide, please, Amika? So we had these recommendations, and all of a sudden, after 3 years, the government the Labour government, that is, decided to publish a response. Conservative government had done absolutely zip about it. It's completely ignored it. And then all of a sudden, the Labour government said, well, we're going to do something about it. And of course, people say, well, it's all because of Elon Musk. I'm not actually sure that's the case. I think actually the Labour government had been looking at it. It takes some time to think about it. But in any event, in January, all of a sudden, we had a flurry of announcement. And this Labour government has said, we are going to do something about this. So what they said is that they said, we will set out a clear timetable, basically. Now, the recommendations they've published, which included, there are others as well, but I put the main ones. First of all, they said the Child Sexual Abuse Review Panel. Now, what that panel does is that if you are a victim of exploitation, the police say, right, no further action. What you could do is you could say to the panel, well, I want that investigated again. But the problem is it only covered allegations made before the 5th of June 2013. Labour government now says, no, it'll cover allegations after that time. Chief constables, the police are to look at historic gang exploitation cases where no further action was recommended. All police forces are expected to implement the recommendations of an inspectorate, and that includes producing problem profiles. Now, what problem profiles are is that they are a model which collects data from various sources as to where abuse is happening, where exploitation is occurring, and in what circumstances. That's what a problem profile. So again, it's all about gathering data. And the Home Office will overhaul the data they have. There's going to be a 3-month audit carried out by a lady called Baroness Casey. Now, she wrote the inquiry into Rotherham, basically, and that is going to look at the current scale and nature of gang-based exploitation. And the government will develop a new framework, basically, for locally led inquiries. So what we'll have, there won't be a national inquiry, but the government will say, well, this is a framework for a local inquiry, and we think that that's the way forward. And finally, the government will put more money into something called the Undercover Online Network, which is another tool used by the police to disrupt child exploitation. The next slide, please, Amika. Let's just look at the Telford inquiry, because this is one of the most recent inquiries, and it gives you an idea about how child sexual exploitation occurs. Now, this is just simply one example. Child exploitation occurs in all sorts of ways. The thing about the Telford inquiry is that what they found is that the way it happened in Telford was the way in which I think most of these things have been reported in places like Rotherham and other towns, where you have people who are driving taxis, people who run takeaway restaurants. And what they are doing is they are using those to lure in children, particularly female children, and then they are abusing those children, and they are posing as boyfriends, basically, and then that leads to a relationship, and then the child is then exploited by others. They're sexually exploited by others. So the Telford inquiry was headed by a KC, Tom Crowther, and what it decided was it made a number of recommendations. So I mean, it started in, I think, it reported in 2022, and then it's come back and it's reviewed the recommendations to see where Telford are. So it's a very good example of how a local authority can investigate exploitation in its area and improve its own practice. So it made quite a few recommendations, but again, I've highlighted the most important ones. It says that the council and the police have to work closely together to review the problem. That's absolutely key because they are the main stakeholders in this. It says that council, police, schools and colleges to prepare data. So schools have to collate data themselves. It's not just the council and the police. The council should maintain and support their dedicated team. So Telford has a dedicated team dealing with child sexual exploitation. And the council, social workers, police officers and teachers should receive specific training on CSE. There should be counselling for victims, and there should be access to mental health trauma, because of course that's very serious indeed. And finally, guidance for sexual health clinics. So that's just a sort of selection of the recommendations that are made. But there's got to be an acceptance right from the top, because what inquiry after inquiry has found is that when these children started coming forward, and we're talking about from at least say 2000, so the problem's been known about in its present form, I think, for about 25 years. But in fact, if you go back over the decades, you can see signs of child exploitation, in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. It was happening then. But the point is, what it's saying is that children cannot be ignored. You have to wake up to the signs and you have to try to tackle it as best you can, given that the raw material for doing things about it are children who are very reluctant to disclose. But the reason why they might be reluctant to disclose is because they are being dismissed. And if they're dismissed, you might as well forget about it. Could we have the next slide, please, Mika? So let's look at the three types of exploitation. So these are labels. These are simply labels that are commonly used. Child criminal exploitation, child sexual exploitation, human slavery, and trafficking. Now, you can be subject to all three. So you can be in a county lines gang and be sexually exploited. You can be trafficked as well. You can be subject to human slavery at the same time. So these are just labels, but they help to define the nature of the problem that we have. Okay, Amika, could we have the next slide, please? So child criminal exploitation. So that is a form of child abuse when a child is exploited into taking part in criminal activity. That's basically what it means. And typically, the most common form of CCE, as we call it, is county lines. And county lines is all about transporting drugs from A to B within the United Kingdom. And the way you do it is you use children to carry those drugs, children to supply those drugs. And in some cases, it will be children who are actually in the process of actually selling the drugs on the street as well. And I have dealt with such a case myself, and it is a very sophisticated operation, and it is designed to stop the police from disrupting it. So the people who are involved in these gangs are involved in a very sophisticated operation, and they use the internet. They use special types of phones. They use prepaid phones, which are anonymous or not completely anonymous. They can be tracked, or they use burner phones, or they use graft phones, which are used to advertise drugs as well. So you can send out what's known as a flare. It's like a sort of menu of all the drugs that you've got available. And of course, that may be 15 types of drug at any one time. And then that phone is then passed from one person to another, and it's used to arrange the sale of drugs. The police have a dedicated team called the National County Lines Coordination Centre, and they report something like 2,500 children being involved. Apparently, it is reducing, but what they say is that's 2,500 children is not all the children. That is just a fraction of a number of children who they think are involved in this dreadful trade. And what it means is that children are forced to carry these drugs. They're financially exploited. They are made to set up the accounts, basically, to launder proceeds. I mean, there's even one case where children are put in bondage. So they said, well, you owe us £5,000. You owe us £5,000 because, you owe us for these drugs or whatever. It might be something completely made up. And apparently one criminal gang actually sold the bond, the debt of these children to another gang, and they bought it and then upped the debt. So, I mean, these gangs are run very much like businesses. They actually market their drugs, and they say, well, our drugs are better than the gang down the street or in another area. Basically, it's a highly sophisticated operation, and the people who are involved, what the police say is that something like 75% of them, when they are brought before the police, 75% of them will have previous convictions for violence. So we're talking about extremely violent people. And that's why it's so very difficult to get children out of these gangs. But people are prosecuted, but it's only a fraction of the problem. That's child criminal exploitation, basically. Let's look at the next slide now. Amika, if we could have the next slide. Now, this is child sexual exploitation. Now, the independent inquiry into child sexual abuse looked specifically at child sexual exploitation. And what they found was this, which is obviously still true today. First of all, it's extremely difficult to identify the networks. Secondly, it's impossible to measure the scale of the problem, and it always will be, which is why collecting data is so important. Um, there has been hesitancy on the part of the authorities to deal with it. Now, one would hope that things have changed, but if you talk to commentators in this area, they say that the police and social services and other bodies are still reluctant. But that historically has been the problem. Children are described as being at risk, whereas in fact they're being abused. So they want to get rid of that. They're either being abused, they might be at risk, but are they actually being abused? The inquiry found that there are two clear indicators of heightened vulnerability, and they are if you're in residential care, if you're in a children's home, or you have a disability. And a disability could mean that you're neurodivergent. These kinds of children are particularly vulnerable. That's what they found. Going missing from home and school, recognized feature of CSE. Social media dating apps commonly used by people. We'll look at the Crime and Policing Bill, which seeks to try to address that problem. And there was a failure to collect data. Could we have the next slide, please, Mika? Human trafficking and slavery. Now, that means servitude, forced or compulsory labor. Exploitation can take many forms: sexual exploitation, forced labor, slavery, servitude, forced criminality, even removal of organs, basically. You might not be a victim of human trafficking, but you could be a victim of modern slavery. And there's common myths about it, such as misconceptions that UK nationals cannot be victims. So human trafficking is not about asylum-seeking children or children coming in or being brought in from another country. It affects children within the UK. These are children who are born within the UK. And as we'll see later, the authorities are able to use the Modern Slavery Act 2015 to prosecute people who are involved in county lines gangs, basically. And there's a guidance document, and the link there can be seen in the notes. Okay, could we have the next slide, please, Amika? Now, how does one recognize that a client is subject to child criminal exploitation? Well, for all three types of exploitation, the government publishes guidelines, and in those guidelines, they have a whole list of the things that you look for, which are too lengthy to set up in this seminar, but you can easily access. And it takes about 5 minutes to read. So if we're looking at child criminal exploitation, missing from home, unwillingness to explain their whereabouts, being found in areas which have no obvious connection, self-harm, changes in emotional well-being, personality, antisocial behavior, and the use of drug and county lines related slang. A great deal of this is common sense, essentially, but this is what inquiries have found. Could we have the next slide, please, Amika? Then we've got child sexual exploitation. And again, there's a guide on this. And potential indicators is acquisition of money, clothes, mobile phones, no plausible explanation, gang association, isolation from college or work, inappropriate sexualized behavior, influence, turning up under the influence of drugs and alcohol, inappropriate sexualized behavior, well, relationships with controlling or significantly older individuals, such as the example that one of the delegates said, a young girl meeting men in the park. That is not a safe place to meet somebody, particularly if the men are older. So that's CSE. Could we have the next slide, please? Slavery and human trafficking. Again, we've got a guide, and Annex A of that guide deals with the indicators. And you've got one particular is no evidence of parental permission for the child to travel to the UK or stay with an accompanying adult, little or no evidence of any pre-existing relationship with the accompanying adult. I mean, I think recently there were figures published on children who had been put in hotels, and a large number of them simply disappeared. And the question is, well, why is that? And the answer must be is that they simply disappeared into exploitation. That was why they were brought over. I mean, as a matter of common sense, the reason why criminals want children is because A, they don't really have to pay them, or they only have to pay them very little, and B, they're very easy to manipulate. And also they have a number of uses. They can be used as drug mules to carry drugs, but they can also be used for exploitation. And that's always been the case. That is why criminals appear in these gangs, children appear in these criminal gangs, because they have that particular use. It's a matter of vulnerability. Could we have the next slide, please? So, how can the law seek to protect child victims of exploitation? So, very briefly, let's look at duties of care. So, local authorities and the police have a series of duties which are all enshrined in statute. And I won't list them. I mean, you can still say them here, but effectively, these have been developed over the decades. And essentially, they will say that NHS, police, prison services, local authorities, they all have a duty towards children. That is the basic tenet of our childcare system. Doesn't matter whether they're in care or not care, the fact is that they will have a duty towards children. They go into a special category, which is quite different from adults. And the law recognizes that children will be vulnerable to child exploitation, and certain types of children are even more vulnerable. Could we have the next slide, please, Amika? So, first of all, we have the Modern Slavery Act 2015. Now, if you look here, you'll see that Section 1.1 says an offence is committed if a person holds another person in slavery or servitude. And that goes very wide indeed, because, of course, you can be held in slavery and servitude, whether you are a victim of criminal exploitation in a drugs gang, sexual exploitation, or human trafficking. So the Act is quite useful when it comes to actually prosecuting people. There's guidance to the Act, and the Act deals specifically with children. And there's a statutory duty on local authorities to notify something called the National Referral Mechanism, where there are reasonable grounds to believe an individual may be a victim of modern slavery or trafficking. And that NRM is a framework for identifying and referring potential victims of modern slavery. So that's something that is specifically designed to protect children. Could we have the next slide, please? So still on the question of this Modern Slavery Act, basically, the slide here explains how the National Referral Mechanism works. So you have a first responder organization, which is going to be the local authority normally, and that's authorized to refer a potential victim of modern slavery into the National Referral Mechanism. And then the state must provide that trafficked child with an independent child trafficking advocate, basically. And having been assessed by a competent authority, the child will be issued with a positive reasonable grounds decision indicated they are a potential victim. Sometimes in these cases, simply the fact that the child has been referred or the child is subject to investigation by the authorities may be sufficient to get them out of the gang. That's why it's so important. It may well be that all of a sudden the gang doesn't want anything more to do with them. Although I have seen at least one case where the gang kept on contacting the victim, so it doesn't necessarily follow. But again, it's not about prosecution. It's about what action can be taken just as a starting point. It may be sufficient, and it may be sufficient for the child to realize that all of a sudden the machinery of the state has started to grind on, and this is very serious, and that could change their viewpoint. Could we have the next slide, please, Amika? Local authority and police powers. Well, I'm sure you're all familiar with this, but a local authority can do a number of things, and they do not need a prosecution to do it. So the police can issue an emergency protection order if they wish. A local authority can take out care proceedings, but there's a whole series of things, a whole series of options available to a local authority. I mean, things like secure accommodation are going to be extremely rare because there simply aren't enough places. I think we all know that. But it might be possible for the child to be put into a children's home. And if it's a specialist children's home, it is possible that the people within that children's home will have specific training on protecting people from exploitation. That could make the difference, particularly if a child is moved out of an area. It's not necessary, because these gangs are very adept at tracking children. They can do that. But sometimes it can work. So there's a whole series of things that a local authority can do. And again, with children, this can be explained. You can explain actually the authorities can act. It's not just the police, it's not just the local authority, it could be the health service. There's a whole series of things that they can do to try and protect you. Could we have the next slide, please, Amika? Let's look very briefly at criminal offences relating to child sexual exploitation. Now, there are no lack of criminal offences for this type of crime. They are very, very wide indeed. So the main ones that one finds in child sexual exploitation, you can see under the 2003 Sexual Offences Act 2003, and they're specifically written for this type of crime: paying for sexual services, causing or inciting exploitation, controlling a child, arranging or facilitating sexual exploitation, basically. So what you generally find is that when these gangs in sexual exploitation are prosecuted, they're generally prosecuted for things like rape because they have committed the rape themselves. So that's the main one that they are prosecuted for. But there isn't a problem with the criminal justice system in finding an offence. There are plenty of them out there. I mean, administration of drugs, for instance, to children, alcohol to children, all of those are actually covered by the criminal justice system. And in the notes, I've set out a full list, or as full a list as I can. Could we have the next slide, please, Amika? Now, we're going to talk now about a new statute which is on the books, which is called the Draft Crime and Policing Act. Now, it's not the law yet, but I suspect that it will become law very quickly. It's a very long act, and it deals with all aspects, a lot of aspects of crime and policing. But the reason why we're interested in it is because it has offences which relate specifically to criminal exploitation. So at the moment, there's no specific crime of, say, child sexual exploitation. There is one in relation to modern slavery, but there's nothing for criminal exploitation or sexual exploitation. So what the government has done is come up with some new offences which will make it easier to prosecute people. So what we've got is we've got section 17, and that says a person aged 18 or over commits an offence if the person engages in contact towards or in respect of a child with the intention of causing the child to engage in criminal conduct. So that could be anything. That could be selling drugs. It could be sexually abusing another child, all kinds of things. But that is criminal exploitation, and the sentence can be up to 10 years. So it's a very wide section. And what this section, or other sections in the Act do, is they create what we call new civil presentative orders. Now, these are orders where you do not need a criminal conviction to go ahead. You don't need that. Also, you don't need sort of beyond reasonable doubt. All you need is for the police to apply to a magistrate's court saying, so and so is criminally exploiting this child. They're going to need some evidence to back it up, but they will apply to the magistrate's court. We want that preventative order slapped on that particular defendant. So you don't need a criminal prosecution. You can even get, I mean, even if you have somebody who is acquitted by a criminal court, so they're up for child sexual exploitation and they get acquitted in a criminal court, you can still get one of these orders against them. You simply apply to the court and the court will say yay or nay. And that will help. We'll see later that there are, in fact, a whole series of things that the police can do. But this is designed, it is aimed at the problem of criminal exploitation. Could we have the next slide, please, Anika? Grooming. So grooming means that you entice children in, you take them in your taxi, you buy them gifts, you may do a number of things. That's all part of the grooming. If you do that and then you go on to sexually exploit them, you get a tougher sentence. That's essentially what it's all about. You just get aggravated means what you've done is far worse than if you just simply sexually abused them. Because there is an element of grooming, we're going to give you more. So that goes into the sentencing guidelines and you get more years, you get more time. So that is the point behind that particular section of a new Crime and Policing Act. Could I have the next slide, please? Cuckooing. Cuckooing is where you're a drugs gang or you're a criminal gang. And what you do is you take over someone's flat or house. And generally it's somebody who's vulnerable. So it might be somebody who has a learning difficulty. And it might be somebody who's elderly or whatever. And what you do is you take over their home and you use it to store drugs, weapons, or you use it for criminal activities, including child exploitation. And it's particularly unpleasant because there are reports of these diaries that are produced by these people who commit this. It's not an offence yet, but it will be. And what they do is they actually video these poor people, and they video them in various states of distress. I mean, this is how evil it is. What the government is doing is that they are creating an offence. So if you take over someone's house, you use it for criminal activity, you will be guilty of the offence of cuckooing. So that is a new offence which is created, and hopefully that should be helpful. Could we have the next slide, please? Online offences. The bill looked at the way in which the internet is used to groom children. And of course, offenders typically use these forums. So you get these sort of odd forums where you can, present yourself as another child, or you get to talk to children, and that's how you groom them into abuse. And what the Act does is it creates an offence, and the offence is aimed at people who moderate. In other words, the people who run these websites. So they'll say, well, you moderators this website and you let this website be used for criminal offences. Now, we already have the Online Safety Act, but this is something that is designed at people who are moderators and who have created these websites so people can come and groom children. So that's section 38. Could I have the next slide, please? 4.6. So this is about the investigation and criminal prosecution, because if you're a child and you're involved in a gang, you will be committing crime. So you may be running drugs, you may be physically or sexually abusing other children, you may be stealing, whatever it may be. That means that you're involved in criminality. So typically the abusers will say to the abused, well, we've got evidence here that you've been part of this gang. If you ever talk to anybody about this, we can guarantee that you will end up in prison for what you've done, and you've committed sex offenders. And also we've got films of you, we've taken videos of you doing all of this. So, you're as guilty as we are. It's a classic way of controlling people. Now, where a child has a concern, it's very important you explain to them that the Crown Prosecution Service and the police, when they investigate these crimes, they are acutely aware that children will be involved in criminality. And although there are various statutory defences such as duress, and under the Modern Slavery Act, there's a particular section that if you are forced to commit a crime as if you're enslaved, then effectively that is a defence to any charge. But generally speaking, the police and the CPS do not set out to prosecute people or victims, because if they did that, you wouldn't get anybody coming forward. So there's almost like a presumption. I mean, it's not what we call a legal presumption, but there's also like a presumption that if you give evidence and you are a child, or even in some cases, if you're an adult, you will not necessarily be prosecuted yourself at all. And there's guidance from both the police and the CPS that says that specifically, that they will consider criminality. But I mean, I'm not aware of any case that I've come across or any case that's been reported of children actually being prosecuted. Technically, it's possible. It just doesn't seem to happen because the law provides that they have certain protections. Not complete, of course, but I would say that there's going to be a very heavy pressure not to prosecute people. Could I have the next slide, please? Now, we talked about a toolkit that the police use, a child exploitation disruption toolkit, and you can see the present one that we have. Now, there are at present a whole series of orders that can be taken out by the police if they want to disrupt a gang. Now, these orders, what they do is they apply to a court. They don't have to apply beyond reasonable doubt. You don't need prosecution. You can simply get a civil order. Now, you've got slavery and trafficking risk orders, slavery and trafficking prevention orders, child abduction, warning notices, sexual risk orders, basically, and sexual harm prevention orders, notification orders, and antisocial behavior injunctions. There's even a measure, you can see it right at the bottom there, that enables the police to obtain information about guests at hotels, because, of course, as we know from many inquiries, children are trafficked into hotels and they are abused in those hotels. And sometimes the allegation is that that's with the connivance of those who own the hotels. So all of these measures have been developed in order to stop exploitation of children, and they are generally civil in nature, which means that they don't need the higher standard of proof. Obviously, you need some evidence to get them, but that is the existing state of the law, in addition to what we saw with the Police and the Crime and Policing Act. Okay, so could we have the next slide, please? We're nearly at the end of the lecture now, but it's important to point out to a child who comes your way, not just that there are all these tools for disrupting gangs, there are things that social services and the police can do, but also the fact that they have rights as well. Now, there is a code, a victim's code, and that victim's code is now enshrined in law. Now, what it means is that instead of it just being a code, which basically means if you're a statutory authority, you should follow it, because it's now enshrined in law, people like the police and local authorities are actually under a duty to follow the code. That's what it means. I mean, some people would say, well, that doesn't really make any difference. But anyway, that is essentially what the law says. Now, vulnerable or intimidated witnesses, and that includes a child who is subject to any kind of exploitation, they will be a vulnerable or intimidated victim. They get certain enhanced rights. So in addition to the full smorgasbord of rights that they get enhanced rights, which are superior to somebody who, say, has been the victim of an assault, but is not actually a vulnerable witness. So you can ask for your police interview to be video recorded to make it easier for you to tell people. I mean, if you're a child, normally they would start off with an ABE interview, which means a video recording, basically. That would always be the starting point. But you can ask for your police interview to be video recorded. And you can have your court cross-examination evidence pre-recorded. So you don't actually have to turn up into court. You can actually say, well, I want my cross-examination pre-recorded, so I don't have to go into a courtroom, an open court, and give evidence in front of my abuser and so on and so forth. I mean, there's all sorts of measures that criminal courts have for child victims. I mean, they can have, they may have the right to an intermediary or whatever it may be. But this is what the code actually says. And it also says information relayed to them. So if, for instance, the Crown Prosecution Service decide that they're not going to proceed, that's information that's got to go to that child within 24 hours. Whereas if you don't have enhanced rights, I think it's about 3 days. So they've got to be immediately told of certain key points during the prosecution, basically. And you may be entitled to the support of an independent sexual advice advisor as well. So that's victims' rights. Let's just go on to the next slide, which is unaccompanied asylum-seeking children. What you need to take into account here, if you're dealing with UASCs, is that they are designated as a particular class of children or child who will be extremely vulnerable. So they will be extremely vulnerable to exploitation. And that's basically, I mean, that's been the case for a long time. So there's statutory guidance that basically says that if you are a UASC, you are particularly vulnerable. And there is guidance issued by the Home Office, which basically says that they have to take that guidance into account when they're dealing with an unaccompanied minor. And there's further guidance, care of unaccompanied migrant children and child victims of modern slavery, basically, which contains detailed information on what local authorities are expected to do with these children when they first come to their attention and they're taken into care, basically. And they may have enhanced immigration rights. They may have protection without simply being deported, which is, of course, key. So that just is to make you aware. If we could have the last slide, please. What I've done is I've put out a series of websites there that you may find helpful. There's no lack of guidance. There's no lack of help on the issue of child exploitation. And there's plenty of it out there. And I mean, all of these websites are very helpful, and they are designed for advocates. They're designed for people to understand, rather than in sort of like very sort of detailed legal terms, because the statutory framework relating to child exploitation has actually become quite complex now. What these websites do is they tell you about the nature of the problem. They tell you about how to recognize it. And they give you some idea about how, in fact, it's tackled by the authorities. I mean, it remains an enormous problem, and it remains a problem about which we're not really doing enough. And again, we're only getting to a very small fraction of the cases. And again, it's a problem, though, where we don't really know how big it is. Anyway, that now brings me to the end of my lecture. So we could have a next slide, please, Amika. And I hope that all that information hasn't left you reeling. As I say, you can read the notes at your leisure, but I'm very happy now to take any questions that people may have at this time. Okay, well, we don't have any questions at this time. So I'll close the seminar. I hope that you found that helpful. We're always grateful for any feedback you may have. Once again, the notes will be sent to you together with the slides. And if anybody has any further questions, please let me know. But thank you very much indeed for attending, and let's just check just in case there's anything else. Oh, sorry, there are some questions. There's a question here. Thank you very much. Can you explain a little bit more about child sexual abuse re county lines? Yes, I can, because I've had a case of that nature. When you get inducted into a gang, it may happen in a variety of ways. So you might be inducted into sexual abuse, and that may happen in a variety of ways. So I've seen it happen through a mosque. It might happen through any number of places. So what happens is that a child is approached. It might be by another child, but it might be people who know them in an odd sort of way. And typically what will happen is that they may be taken to a house, and then all of a sudden they find themselves either being sexually abused, or they may be offered sex. They may be offered drugs. It's always different, but the people who run these gangs always seem to know how to grab people in. So you have the experience of Telford, which was taxi drivers and takeaways, but it doesn't always happen in that particular way. However, from that, you then find that you are being asked to carry drugs. And that may be, you may be carrying drugs from London to Birmingham, or you may be assisting in drugs. But what happens is that you are being sexually abused by members of the gang, and you're being sexually abused by people who may not be in the gang, and at the same time you are being forced to carry drugs. Or it may well be that you are being asked to look after a cannabis farm, or you are being asked to look after a house which is used to store drugs. I mean, there's a whole series of things that you may be asked to do. I mean, the other way in which it may be done is that you are recruited simply for the purposes of carrying drugs. And again, this is all done in a very subtle way. The people who commit these crimes seem to be extremely adept at knowing A, who their victims are, how far they can go, and how subtly they can get them into a position. And the internet is absolutely key because typically the child may be given a mobile phone, and that mobile phone is their contact with the gang. And the gang always seems to know where they are. And how do they know where they are? Because if you have a mobile phone, they can track you. I mean, I've even come across a case where the gang will notify the police anonymously that this particular child is carrying drugs. And what happens is that the police pick up the child. They won't have any drugs, but the reason why that's done is to check what the child will do. Will the child tell the police, well, I'm part of a gang, or will they keep silent? So they use all sorts of ways, but there is no one model in answer to your question. It always happens in different ways, but the people who do it are extremely adept and extremely experienced, and they are violent as well. So there's always the underlying current of violence. If you step out of line, you will turn up dead. That's what they'll be told. Or they may be subject to some kind of physical abuse, some kind of coercion. There is no one model in these things. The other question was, what will the police be prosecuting under? Well, at the moment, the two offences that if you're a member of a criminal gang and you're involved in county lines, what you would be prosecuted for is A, the supply of drugs, so possession and supply. That's going to be the first thing. And what people also are prosecuted for is under modern slavery. So they will say, well, you had this child running drugs for you. And in fact, you were doing that by coercion. That fits neatly within Section 1 of the Modern Slavery Act. So the Modern Slavery Act is actually used. I don't think it was actually intended for drugs offences or for county lines, but it has actually been used successfully. In CSE cases, typically it'll be child sexual exploitation. Sorry, it'll be rape or sexual assault that you'd be prosecuted for. These are very serious crimes for which you could get up to life in prison. You have to remember when people are prosecuted, I mean, there's only so many. What they do is they choose the offences that they think are going to stick, that are going to work. So you can add on a whole sort of like list of counts if you like, but the trouble is it may not actually make any difference to the amount of time that the person's going to be in prison, because typically the court will say, well, you're done for rape and you're also done for modern slavery, but those sentences that are handed out concurrently, so they run together. So the Crown Prosecution Service are quite careful about which offences they will use, basically. So typically those are the kinds of offences that you will find. It'll be the primary offence of running drugs, committing sexual offences, and then you may find added on to that modern slavery. And of course, with the Crime and Policing Act, I think you will find child exploitation also being used as a new offence, basically. I think the sentence for that is up to 10 years. But I mean, if you're being prosecuted, I mean, if you get, say, 15 years already for the rape of a child, then the 15 years and 10 years run together. They're not sort of put up on top. Okay, right. So with that, I will close the seminar. And once again, thank you very much indeed. And we hope to see you for our next seminar. I've forgotten what it is, but I think you've all seen the program, and I hope to see as many of you as can come along to that. Okay, goodbye.